The mill wasn't broken. It just wasn't the right machine anymore. By the time the water pulled back, there wasn't much left to fix. The wheel still stood. The shaft still turned. The frame held. But the thing that made it work, the thing that turned motion into something useful, was gone. Maeve Carter stood at the edge of the creek, boots buried in wet silt, staring at what the flood had left behind. Not destruction, interruption. The creek had swollen overnight. Snowmelt from higher ground, warm rain pushing it faster than it could carry itself. It hit before dawn. By morning, the dam had split. Not completely, just enough. Enough for the water to take what it needed. The pond drained. The current surged through. And everything downstream of the wheel was soaked, twisted, or useless. Maeve didn't run when it happened. There was nowhere to go. She stayed in the house above the ridge. Listened to it. The sound of water breaking wood. The low, grinding pull of something larger than anything she could stop. And then, silence. That was worse. Because silence meant it was over. She walked down at first light. Step by step. Careful. Like the ground might still give way beneath her. The path she knew was gone. Washed flat. The creek had redrawn everything. When she reached the mill, she stopped. Not because it was destroyed. Because it wasn't. The wheel stood. Heavy oak, dark with water, still locked in place. The shaft connected. The gearing intact. Everything that moved. Still could. But the saw, the blade was split clean through. A fracture from edge to center. Thin. Almost invisible. Until you knew what it meant. It meant it would never spin again. Maeve stepped closer. Reached out. Ran her fingers across the metal. Cold. Still. Finished. She didn't pull her hand away. Not right away. Because that blade had been everything. When the harvest failed, it paid. When repairs were needed, it paid. When winter came, it paid. And now, it was nothing. Maeve closed her eyes for a moment. Not long. Just enough to feel it. The weight of what was gone. Then she opened them again. And looked past it. Because something else was still there. The wheel. The slow drip of water still feeding it. The shaft. The gears. The entire system. Waiting. Not dead. Idle. She stepped back. Looked at the whole thing. Not as a sawmill. As a machine. And that changed everything. Behind her, the land was already drying. The flood had passed. What came next wouldn't be water. It would be cold. Hard. Long. The kind that didn't care if you were ready. Maeve turned back to the creek. Watched the current move. Steady. Unbroken. Even now. You're still running. The words barely left her lips. They were enough. Because in that moment, she understood something no one else had seen yet. The problem wasn't that the mill had stopped working. It was that it had been built for the wrong season. And if she tried to fix it the same way, it would fail again. Maeve Carter didn't need to repair the mill. She needed to change what it was. Maeve didn't go to town that day. She didn't ask for help. Didn't ask what it would cost to replace the blade. Because she already knew. Too much. And even if she had the money, it wouldn't solve the real problem. She walked the mill house again. Slower this time. Not looking at what was broken. Looking at what still moved. The wheel turned when the creek pushed it. The shaft carried that motion inward. The gears transferred it. Everything worked. Except the ending. She stood beside the frame where the blade had been. Empty now. Still. And she imagined it. Not as a saw. But as something else. Something that didn't need speed. Didn't need precision cuts. Something that only needed motion. The idea didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces. A memory of grain sacks stacked in the barn last winter. A memory of waiting. 3 days for grinding. Sometimes more. A memory of the cold. The way it settled in. Stayed longer than it should. And the way the town mill stopped. Not every year, but often enough. Because still water freezes. Maeve turned toward the creek again. Moving water didn't. Not the same way. Not if it kept moving. That difference, that small, quiet difference, was everything. By the next morning, she had started. Not repairing. Changing. She removed the blade completely. Set it aside. Not with anger. Not with regret. Just final. Then she measured the shaft. The height. The spacing. Working it out in her head before she touched anything else. Because this time, she wasn't guessing. She was building for something that hadn't arrived yet. And it needed to hold. By midday, someone came down the path. Bootsteps. Familiar. Caleb Dunn. Neighbor from the ridge above. He stopped at the doorway. Looked inside. Took in the empty frame. The missing blade. Then the tools laid out across the floor. What happened? Maeve didn't look up. Flood took the blade. Caleb nodded. Slow. You getting a new one? Maeve paused. Just for a second. Then shook her head. No. Caleb frowned. Then what are you doing? Maeve stood. Wiped her hands against her coat. Changing it. He looked around again. At the wheel. The shaft. The empty space where something should have been. Into what? Maeve met his eyes. Something that still works when everything else stops. Caleb let out a breath. Half confused. Half amused. That doesn't sound like a sawmill. It isn't. Silence settled between them. Not tense. Just uncertain. Caleb stepped inside. Ran his hand along the shaft. It'll still turn. Maeve nodded. That's the point. He looked back at her. You're not fixing it. No. I'm making sure it doesn't fail again. Caleb studied her for a moment longer, then shook his head slightly. Winter's a long way off. Maeve turned back to the frame. Not as long as people think. He didn't argue. Didn't agree either. Just stood there, watching something take shape he didn't understand. By evening, the structure had changed. The empty frame now held a new mount. Rough. Incomplete. But intentional. Not for cutting. For turning. Maeve worked until the light dropped. Until the shadows filled the mill house. Until the sound of the creek outside became the only thing left. And through it all, the wheel kept moving. Steady. Unbothered. Waiting. Maeve stepped back. Looked at what she had started. Not finished. Not ready. But different. And that difference was the only thing that mattered. Because when the cold came, it wouldn't care what the mill used to be. Only what it had become. By the time the cold settled in for good, no one questioned it anymore. They didn't ask why her mill still ran. They didn't ask how. They just came. Before sunrise. After dark. Wagons lined the path down to the creek. Tracks pressed into frozen ground that didn't soften anymore. Grain stacked high. Waiting. Maeve worked through it. Not fast. Not careless. Steady. Because steady was what kept it alive. The wheel turned. The creek moved beneath a skin of ice that never closed. And inside, the stones hummed. Low. Constant. Like something that had always been there. Just waiting for someone to use it the right way. Marlowe came back again. Not as a visitor. As someone who understood. He stood beside the wall, watching the system run. You didn't rebuild anything. Maeve adjusted the flow. Checked the grind. No. He looked at the wheel. You replaced it. Maeve shook her head slightly. I removed the part that failed. Marlowe let out a breath, then nodded, because there was nothing else to argue. Outside, the cold held. Day after day, the pond in town stayed frozen. The other mill stayed silent. And the people who had once waited there, waited here now. But they didn't wait long. Because this system didn't stop. Didn't depend on still water. Didn't depend on the seasons staying kind. It worked. Because it was built for when things didn't. By midwinter, Maeve wasn't working alone anymore. A boy from up the ridge came first. Quiet. Watchful. Hands that learned quickly. Then another. Not to take over, but to keep it moving. Because now, it mattered beyond her. The grain that came in, came from every direction. And the meal that left, kept people fed. Not comfortably, but enough. And out here, enough was survival. By the time the thaw came, no one needed to explain it anymore. They had lived it. They had seen what stopped. And what didn't. The pond broke first. Ice splitting. Water returning. The town mill started again. Slow. Uncertain. Like something waking up too late. Some people went back. Out of habit. Out of distance. But not all. Because they knew now. What winter had already proven. Maeve stood beside the creek that morning. Watching the water run clear again. Unchanged. It hadn't stopped for her. It hadn't waited. It had just kept moving. The whole time. That was never the problem. The words barely carried. But they didn't need to. Because the answer had already been built. Behind her. The wheel turned. The stones moved. The system held. Not because it had been repaired, but because it had been changed. The mill had never truly been broken.
Been built for the wrong moment. And when the moment changed, Maeve Carter changed with it. That was the difference. And that was what kept it running when everything else stopped. The freeze didn't arrive all at once. It settled in. Slow. Quiet. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It takes hold. By the second night, the ground had hardened. By the third, the edges of the creek began to stiffen. Thin sheets of ice forming along the banks. Fragile. Temporary. But a warning. Maeve stood beside the wheel at dawn. Watched the water move. It hadn't slowed. Not even a little. That mattered more than anything else. Because in town, everything had changed. The pond had frozen. Not at once. Not clean. Layer by layer. Until the surface locked. And the wheel stopped. At first, they waited. They always did. Because it had happened before. A day. Maybe two. Then the thaw would come. But it didn't. The cold held. And by the fourth morning, the mill in town was silent. No grinding. No movement. Nothing. That was when they started moving. Not working. Looking. For somewhere else. Maeve didn't hear about it right away. She felt it. The shift. More footsteps on the path. More voices outside the mill. By mid-morning, the first wagon arrived. A man she didn't recognize. He stepped down slowly. Looked at the wheel. Then at the creek. Then back at the wheel again. It's still running. Maeve nodded. It will. He didn't ask why. He already knew what mattered. Can you grind today? Maeve stepped aside. Bring it in. He didn't hesitate. By noon, 3 more came. Then 5. Then more. Not curious now. Desperate. Because what had been optional was now necessary. Inside the mill, the sound changed. Louder. Heavier. More grain. More weight. But the system held. The stones turned. Steady. Unbothered by the cold outside. Marlowe arrived just after midday. Face tight. Hands stiff. He didn't speak at first. just stood in the doorway, watching the wheel turn, watching the grain fall. Then, you knew. Maeve didn't look up. I knew the creek wouldn't stop. Marlowe stepped inside. Parnell's pond is solid. Maeve nodded. It always is. He let that sit. Then looked at the system again. At the wheel. The shaft. The stones. All of it working. While everything else had failed. You built this for this. Maeve finally looked at him. No. I built it for when everything else wouldn't. Silence filled the space. Not confusion anymore. Understanding. Outside. More wagons lined the path. Waiting. Because now, there was only one place left. By evening, Maeve hadn't stopped moving. Hands steady. Movements controlled. Not rushing. Because rushing breaks systems. And this couldn't break. Not now. Not when everyone depended on it. The cold deepened that night. That cuts through wood, through cloth, through bone. But the creek kept moving, and the wheel kept turning. Inside the mill, the stones never stopped. And for the first time since the flood, Maeve wasn't trying to rebuild something lost. She was running something that worked. And outside, the world was beginning to understand why she never tried to fix it. By the time the air started to change, Maeve had already finished the first version. Not perfect, not complete, but working. The wheel turned, the shaft carried it, and at the end of that motion, something new moved with it, slower than the saw had, heavier, but steady. The first time it ran, the sound was different, no sharp cut, no bite of steel through wood, just a low, continuous grind. Maeve stood beside it, listening. Not just to the machine, but to what it meant, because this wasn't about replacing what she lost. It was about changing what the mill did. By late summer, people had started to notice, not because of the machine, but because of what came out of it, grain, ground fine, even, better than what most of them were used to. They came out of curiosity at first, one sack, maybe two, just to see if it worked. Maeve didn't rush, didn't promise anything. She just let the system run, let them watch, and that was enough. By early autumn, she had regulars, not many, but enough. Farmers who didn't want to wait days for grinding in town, farmers who noticed the difference, and farmers who liked that the wheel turned every day, no delays, no excuses, just steady work. Caleb came back once, stood in the doorway again, watching. This time, he didn't laugh. You changed the whole thing. Maeve kept her hands on the frame. Feeling the vibration. Only the end of it. Caleb nodded slowly. That's all it took. Maeve shook her head. No, that's all anyone sees. He didn't ask more, didn't need to. Because outside, the land had started to shift again, the warmth was leaving. Slowly. Quietly. The mornings carried frost now, thin, barely visible, but there. And the creek still moved. Unchanged. Maeve noticed the difference in the wheel first, not in how it turned, but in how the air felt around it. Colder. Sharper. But the motion didn't slow, didn't hesitate, it just kept going. That mattered, because in town, things were already changing. The pond behind the main mill had dropped. Not from lack of water, from stillness. Surface turning flat, quiet. Waiting. Maeve had seen it before, water that doesn't move, doesn't last the same way. She adjusted the system, small changes. Tightened the fittings, rebalanced the load. Made sure nothing would seize when the temperature dropped further. Because this time, she wasn't reacting.
She was preparing. By the first hard frost, the difference was undeniable. The mornings came colder. The air held longer. And the town mill started slowing, not stopping, not yet. But struggling. Maeve's didn't. The creek kept moving. The wheel kept turning. The stones kept grinding. Steady,
Interrupted, and the people who had tried her mill out of curiosity started coming back out of necessity. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to feel it shifting. Because survival doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly. Until one day, it's the only thing left that works. And that day was closer than anyone realized.